Good morning dear students, and welcome to the second part of our chapter Life Processes in Living Organisms. In our previous video we had covered everything to do with asexual reproduction in unicellular and multicellular organisms. So now we move on to the second part of our chapter, which is going to cover sexual reproduction in plants. The first step is understanding what do you mean by sexual reproduction. It occurs with the help of female and male germ cells or gametes. When you have the union of female gametes and male gametes, the process in which the new organism or a new offspring is formed, it is called as sexual reproduction. And this happens with the help of gametes. So first you have gamete formation, which takes place by meiosis cell division. You already know what meiosis is, what mitosis is. So gamete formation takes place with the help of meiosis, and when this process takes place, the chromosome number is reduced to half. The number of chromosomes which are present in the offspring, it gets reduced to half. The haploid gametes are formed. When the chromosome numbers are reduced to half the number of chromosomes, the gametes which are formed are called as haploid gametes because the number of chromosomes is half. Then you have zygote formation. Zygote formation takes place with the help of mitosis cell division, and in mitosis what happens is that it will have a union of the haploid male and female gametes. The haploid gametes which are formed over here, the male and the female gametes will come together and the union of the gametes will take place, and once that union is taking place, you have something which is called as a zygote. A zygote formation takes place, and this zygote is having diploid number of chromosomes, which means that because it is having haploid, which means half the number of chromosomes are from male and female, the total number of chromosome gets complete and you have a diploid zygote which is formed. What is the importance of sexual reproduction? First of all, sexual reproduction takes place wherein you have a male and a female parent involved. If you remember, in asexual reproduction we did not talk anything about the involvement of two parents. Over there the process of reproduction was completed only with the help of one single parent, but in sexual reproduction male and female parents are both involved. Fusion of male and female gametes completes the process of reproduction. As we saw in our previous slide, we saw that the union of the haploid male and female gametes helps in the formation of zygote. So only when you have the female and the male gametes coming together, the process of sexual reproduction gets completed. The new individual has recombined genes of both the parents. The new offspring, the new child or the new individual which has formed, the new zygote which is formed, it is having chromosomes which are present from both the male and the female parent. It is a recombination of genes, a recombination of chromosomes, and that chromosomes have been received from the male and from the female parent. Diversity arises due to genetic variation. Now because the new individual which is getting formed is receiving the genes from the male and from the female gametes, from the male and the female parents, because of this the chromosomes which are now present in the new individual is very much different as compared to what is present in the mother and what is present in the father, that is the male and the female. This helps the organism to maintain their existence. Now because of this new chromosomes which are formed, that new individual which is formed is now able to maintain its existence. It will help in the process of evolution of that particular organism. Now we will be studying basically the sexual reproduction which takes place in plants. In plants, the flower is considered as the main reproductive organ of the plant, and in this picture we see the different parts of the flower. Your flower is made up of sepals, petals, carpels and stamens, and something which is called as a receptacle which connects to the pedicel. Now we'll see in detail what do you mean by all this. Your petals first, they are your the most attractive part of the flower. When we look at the flower, we will first look at the color of the flower. The color of the flower is given to the flower by the petals. You have flowers in different colors, okay, that is because your petals are of different colors. So your petals are the most attractive part of the flower. It not only attracts human beings, it also attracts insects and animals to the flowers. Then you have the sepals. The sepals are the tiny green parts which are present in the flower. What is the main function of these sepals? It protects the flower in the bud condition. When the flower is a bud, a small tiny bud, it needs protection. So at that point of time, the sepals is what protects the flower when it is in a bud condition. Then you have the carpels. The carpels are the female reproductive part of the flower, and it is made up of three parts: stigma, style, ovary, and inside the ovary you have ovules. So you have stigma, the style, and the ovary, and inside the ovary you have these tiny egg-like structures which are called as the ovules. The stamens are the male reproductive part of the flower, and it is made up of two parts: anthers and filaments. This bag-like structure which is called as anthers, and this long structure which is called as filament. Now we come to accessory whorls and essential whorls. As I said, your flower is made up of these four important parts: androecium, gynoecium, corolla, and calyx. Androecium means your male reproductive part of the flower, and gynoecium is the female reproductive part of the flower. The androecium and gynoecium are the two parts which are directly involved in the process of reproduction. So these two are called as the essential whorls. They are the most important part of the flower which directly help in the process of reproduction. The other two parts, that is your corolla and the calyx. The corolla is your petals and the calyx is your sepals, the green part of the flower. So these two do not actually take part in the process of reproduction, but you can say they indirectly help in the process of reproduction. How do they help indirectly? The calyx takes care of the flower, protects the flower in the bud condition, and the petals or the corolla helps in the attraction of insects and other organisms to the flower. So they are not directly associated with the process of reproduction, they just are indirectly helping in the process of reproduction. So hence they are called as the accessory whorls of the flower. The next we come to bisexual flowers and monosexual flowers. In bisexual flowers, your example is hibiscus, which we commonly also called as China rose, or it is also called as a shoe flower, very commonly available flower. So in bisexual flower like hibiscus flower, the male reproductive part and the female reproductive part both are present inside one single flower. But in monosexual flowers, for example a papaya plant, if you have seen growing in your gardens or in your villages, you might see that some papaya plants have very big flowers. Okay, these papaya plants which have big flowers, these are the female flowers. It contains only the female reproductive part of the flower. And in these flowers, these you must have seen some papaya plants which have very thin flowers. These flowers contain only the male reproductive part of the flower. So in this papaya plant, you see that the female flowers or the female part of the flower and the male part of the flower are growing in two separate flowers. So such flowers are called as monosexual flowers. Now we come to the stalk of the flower. You know, when you hold a rose, you have a stick like or a stalk like thing which you use to hold that particular flower. So this is called as the pedicel. Okay, the stalk by which we hold a flower is called as a pedicel, and the flowers which have this pedicel, this stalk like structure, they are called as pedicellate flowers. Your example is a rose. The flowers which do not have the stalk, you see the stalk, that stalk is not present over here. The flower is directly attached to the branch. So these flowers are called as sessile flowers. Your example is a moss rose. You must have seen this growing in your balconies or in many gardens. These flowers do not have a stalk. You cannot hold the flower using a stalk. You have to hold the entire flower in your hand. Okay, so these flowers are called as sessile flowers. Now we'll look at the male and the female reproductive parts of the flower in detail. Your male reproductive part of the flower is called as the androecium, and it is made up of stamens. Okay, what is a stamen? This diagram that is shown over here, this is a stamen. The stamen, the main function of the stamen is to produce pollen grains. Okay, you see this dot structures over here, these are your pollen grains, and these pollen grains are produced inside this bag like structure which is called as the anther, and this thin structure that you see, this tube like structure that you see, is called as a filament. So your stamen is made up of two parts, which is your anther and the filament, the anther and the filament. The function of the anther is to produce pollen grains. It produces the pollen grains, and the filament, it provides support to the anther. It holds the anther high up in the flower. So it provides support to the anther. Then you have the gynoecium. The gynoecium is the female reproductive part of the flower, and it is made up of carpels. The main function of carpels is to produce ovules. Okay, this is a carpel. It is one single carpel, and it is made up of three parts: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The stigma, which is over here, it is a very sticky part of the carpel. Then you have a style. The style is a long hollow tube like structure which connects the stigma to the ovary. The ovary is a fat, a little bulging part of the flower of the carpel, and inside the ovary you have many tiny egg like structures. These egg like structures are called as the ovules. Okay, so your carpel is made up of stigma, style, and ovary, and inside the ovary you have ovules. Okay, so just look at it. Your stigma receives the pollen grains during the process of pollination, which I'll explain further. The stigma does the work of receiving pollen grains. In this previous picture, I had told you that these are pollen grains. These pollen grains falls on the stigma. Okay, the pollen grains fall on the stigma. So the stigma does the work of receiving the pollen grains. The style, it connects the stigma to the ovary. It is a long hollow structure which connects the stigma to the ovary. And finally the ovary, it produces ovules. The function of the ovary is to produce ovules. Now what exactly is pollination? Now pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. When the pollen grains are transferred from the male reproductive part, that is from the anther, to the female reproductive part, which is the stigma, that particular process is called as pollination. So the definition of pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. And what are the different agents, what are the different things which can help in the process of pollination? You have wind, water, insects, and animals. All these agents help in the process of pollination. Now what exactly is pollination? You see this anther, the pollen grains, the small orange structures which are over here, these are your pollen grains. These pollen grains can get stuck onto the body of the insect or on the face of the animals which eat plants. Okay, it can get stuck onto the body of the animal or on the body of the insects, and this insects, you know, they keep moving from one flower to another in search of nectar. So that pollen grain can now when this insect will visit another flower, that pollen grain from the body of this particular insect will get stuck onto the stigma of this flower. Okay, so this process of transfer of pollen grains from the male reproductive part to the female reproductive part is called as pollination. Now, types of pollination. Pollination can either be self-pollination or cross-pollination. In self-pollination, you have only one flower involved. So, the pollen grain from the anther will get transferred to the stigma of the same flower. Okay, the pollen grains are not moving onto another flower. The pollen grains are remaining in the same flower from the anther to the stigma of the same flower. But in cross pollination, the pollens from one anther, from one flower, can get transferred onto the stigma of another flower. This can happen because of wind or water, or because of insects, or because of animals. So here there are two flowers involved, and the pollen grains get transferred from one flower to another flower. So hence it is cross pollination. The next step after pollination is fertilization. What happens after the pollen grains move from the anther to the stigma, from the male reproductive part to the female reproductive part, when the pollen grain reaches the stigma? Okay, as I said, the stigma is very sticky. The pollen grain gets easily stuck on the stigma. The blue part you see over here, that is your stigma. The yellow parts over here, that is your pollen grains. The pollen grains from the anther gets stuck on the stigma, and when it reaches the stigma, the pollen grains start growing. Okay, it forms a tube like structure which is called as the pollen tube. It will keep growing, it will enter into the style, and from the style it will enter into the ovary of the flower. After it enters into the ovary, it will release the male gametes. Inside the ovary, the ovules are already present. So the male gametes will unite with the female gametes, that is the ovules, and this will form the zygote which will form the seed of that particular plant. Okay, so this, once the seed is formed, the process of fertilization gets completed. After this, we move to the next stage, which is germination. The seeds which is now grown inside the flower, the seed which is now generated, we can take that seed and we can put it into the ground, we can put it into the soil, and after a few days that seed will grow, and slowly growth will take place, and finally you will get a new plant which is formed. Okay, so how exactly does the process of sexual reproduction in plants take place? It starts with the process of pollination. After pollination, there is a process of fertilization, and after fertilization, the seed is formed, and that seed, when you grow, the new plant is then formed, which is your germination. So in plants, sexual reproduction takes place in three different phases. You have pollination, fertilization, and finally germination. Okay, so with this, dear students, we complete the part of sexual reproduction in plants. The next part of your chapter is sexual reproduction in animals. For that, I will be sending across a few video links which you will have to sit and watch, and once that is done, we will be completing this chapter of life processes in living organisms. And if you have any doubts with regards to any part of the chapter, you can always get in touch with me, and we'll get it sorted out for you, we'll get it solved. Once this is done, I will be conducting a Zoom session with you, wherein I will be having a oral test with you. Okay, so you can go through the video as many times as you want, and as I said, if you have any difficulties, you can always get back to me. And till we meet again in the next session, stay safe, stay happy. Bye.